At 10 in the morning on July 26, 1943, the air suspended over the Markham Valley in New Guinea was so thick and humid it felt as though it could drown a man. Even at an altitude of 20,000 feet, an environment that should have offered a freezing reprieve, the relentless tropical sun beat down without mercy on the plexiglass canopies of the American fighter formation, turning their cockpits into suffocating greenhouses. Right in the midst of this lethargic, sweltering heat, the radio suddenly erupted in a frantic burst of static. Boiling up from the towering tropical cumulonimbus clouds beneath them, moving like a swarm of furious hornets, came dozens of Japanese fighter planes painted with the glaring red rising sun. This was no accidental encounter, it was a premeditated aerial ambush. At that exact moment, a massive, bizarrely shaped twin-engine American heavy fighter did not turn tail and flee. Instead, its pilot shoved the throttles all the way forward and dropped the aircraft like an 8-ton solid iron anvil directly into the numerically superior and infinitely more agile Japanese swarm. The man at the controls of this mechanical beast was a 22-year-old, teetotaling, non-smoking farm boy from Wisconsin. Over the course of the next 12 minutes, he would utterly rewrite the tactical rulebook of aerial combat in the Pacific theater. It would prove to the world that within the razor-thin margin between life and death, in the ultimate expression of violent aesthetics, a true hunter never bothers to wrestle with his prey. Let us return to those smoke-filled skies of World War II and uncover how America's deadliest ace, Richard Bong, alongside his twin-tailed demon, the P-38 Lightning, orchestrated a chilling symphony of destruction against impossible odds. To truly comprehend the terrifying slaughter that unfolded in those 12 minutes, we must first strip away the romanticized delusions of dogfighting perpetuated by modern cinema. Authentic World War II aerial combat was never a graceful, chivalrous duel among the clouds. It was not a waltz of two aircraft gracefully looping, undrolling. When machines are pushed to their absolute physical limits, combat becomes a brutal, unforgiving extraction of everything steel gravity and human physiology can endure. If you attempted to engage a Japanese Eero or an Oscar in a horizontal turning fight over the Pacific, you were effectively signing your own death warrant. The Japanese fighters of that era were impossibly light and nimble, acting as the sky's most elegant swordsmen. They were expressly designed to utilize incredibly tight turning radii to effortlessly pull heavy, cumbersome American planes into their crosshairs. For rookie Allied pilots, once caught in the deadly merry-go-round of a dogfight with a Zero, the outcome was almost always the same: the enemy would effortlessly slip behind them, followed by a lethal burst of cannon fire. This paralyzing fear of horizontal combat hung like a nightmare over the Southwest Pacific in 1943. Yet, looking into the eyes of First Lieutenant Richard Bong, one would find no trace of fear. There was only an eerie, absolute calm. This tranquility did not stem from a naive ignorance of death, but rather from a chillingly precise, calculated grasp of geometry. Beneath his quiet, almost bashful exterior lay a mind endowed with a terrifying intuition for aviation mechanics and the laws of physics. Growing up on a farm in Poplar, Wisconsin, Bong had been operating heavy agricultural machinery long before his feet could even reach a tractor's clutch pedal. He understood engine torque intrinsically. He understood metal fatigue. He knew better than anyone exactly where the breaking point of a machine lived. He knew that to hunt a strong buck in the deep woods, you didn't need to run faster than the deer. You needed to understand the trajectory of the bullet, the path of the wind, and possess an absolute, cold-blooded stillness in the microsecond before pulling the trigger. Similarly, hunting agile Japanese fighters in the sky did not require outturning them. It required treating his own aircraft as a purely physical instrument, utilizing a ruthlessly mathematical logic to crush the opposition. And right in his hands, the United States Army Air Forces had placed exactly that kind of weapon, an unconventional, rule-breaking machine of death. In the summer of 1943, the P-38 Lightning was a freak of engineering. In the eyes of purist fighter pilots, it barely qualified as a fighter at all. It looked more like a heavy monster violently cobbled together from two massive tail booms to deafening 1,150 horsepower Allison engines and a central pod to hold the pilot. Fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, the beast weighed a staggering 8 tons. To Japanese aces, accustomed to flying planes as light as feathers, planes that sacrificed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks at the altar of maneuverability, this twin-tailed American aircraft was as clumsy as a pregnant duck. In the minds of the Japanese, immense size equated to a massive turning radius, making it the perfect, unmissable target for their cannons. They fully believed that the moment this behemoth dared to enter a traditional turning fight, the nimble's arrows would tear it to shreds like a pack of wolves dragging down an elephant. But the Japanese made a fatal miscalculation. They measured this air, a defining killing machine using conventional aerodynamic logic, completely failing to understand the true soul breathed into the aircraft by Lockheed's genius engineers. The essence of the P-38 had absolutely nothing to do with turning. Because it utilized two massive engines, the engineers implemented a brilliantly forward-thinking design counter-rotating propellers. It sounds like a minor mechanical tweak, but in the crucible of air combat, it meant everything. In a traditional single-engine fighter, violently pushing the throttle creates massive engine torque that inevitably pulls the aircraft to one side, forcing the pilot to stomp on the rudder pedal just to fly straight. This physical struggle saps the pilot's stamina and ruins the plane's aiming precision at high speeds. But the P-38's counter-rotating props perfectly canceled out that infuriating torque. This granted the 8-ton giant terrifying straight-line stability at an explosive, rocket-like climb rate. When Bong pushed the throttles to the firewall, the P-38 liced through the air like a cruise missile, utterly stable, devastatingly precise. Even more horrifying was its armament. On standard single-engine fighters like the P-51 Mustang or P-40 Warhawk, the machine guns were mounted in the wings. For the bullets to hit a target, engineers had to angle the barrels inward to create a convergence point about 300 yards ahead of the aircraft. If the enemy was right at that sweet spot, they were shredded. If they were too close or too far, the bullets would spray harmlessly past them like an open net. The P-38 had no such weakness. Its .450 caliber heavy machine guns and single 20mm cannon were packed tightly together in the cramped nose of the central pod. This was not just a collection of guns, it was a literal airborne chainsaw forged of leaden fire. It fired a flawlessly straight, ultra-dense stream of metal. Whether the target was 100 yards away or 800 yards away, the moment they were brushed by this unyielding whip of fire, they were instantly erased. Bong knew every quirk of his machine. He was never going to fly in circles with the enemy. He was going to use the sheer mass of his aircraft, the violent power of its twin engines, and the devastating, concentrated firepower in its nose to completely dominate the three-dimensional vertical battlefield. The 12-minute countdown to death officially began in that sweltering sky, looking down at a dark swarm of 30 to 40 Japanese fighters rapidly climbing. To tear into the American B-25 bombers, Bong didn't hesitate. Tactical manuals dictated that when facing such overwhelming numbers, escort fighters should maintain a defensive posture and harass the enemy from the perimeter, but Bong knew defense was just a slow suicide. He had to take the initiative and shatter their rhythm with absolute violence before they could form up. He shoved the yoke forward. From 20,000 feet, 8 tons of steel surrendered to the brutal pull of gravity, initiating a maddening freefall. The airspeed indicator whipped past 350 miles per hour, then 400. The aircraft's aluminum skin began to howl against the extreme airflow. The noise in the cockpit growing so deafening Bong couldn't hear his own breath. The P-38 was hurtling toward a terrifying physical trap. The edge of the sound barrier. At such extreme dive speeds, the air rushing over the wings approached the speed of sound, creating localized supersonic shockwaves. This phenomenon shattered the smooth airflow over the tail, rendering the elevators useless in a pocket of dead air. In aviation, it was known as the deadly compressibility. Countless brave test pilots had died screaming in unrecoverable dives because of it, watching the Earth rush up to smash them. Bong felt the yoke turn to stone in his hands. It felt as though he were trying to bend steel rebar embedded in solid concrete. The violent shuddering of the aircraft threatened to rattle his bones apart, and his vision blurred from the high-frequency vibrations. But he knew exactly where the red line was, like a madman dancing on the edge of a razor. He used minute, agonizingly precise muscle inputs to keep the beast hovering at the absolute threshold of structural failure. A fraction faster, and the plane would disintegrate a fraction slower, and he wouldn't have the lethal kinetic energy he needed. Below, the Japanese pilots looked up in horror at the spectacle. A massive, twin-tailed aircraft, roaring with an apocalyptic thunder, was tearing through the heavens like a flaming meteor, aimed straight at the heart of their formation, according to Japanese naval aviation doctrine. The best counter to such a reckless diving attack was to stay calm, wait until the very last second, and use the Zero's phenomenal agility to snap into a hard horizontal turn. The heavy American plane, unable to alter its trajectory at such high speeds, would blast helplessly past them, allowing the Zeros to easily slide onto its tail and secure the kill. The lead Japanese commander, an experienced veteran, executed this maneuver flawlessly, eyes locked on the rapidly expanding silhouette of the P-38. He waited for the mathematically perfect moment and yanked his stick, banking the Zero sharply to the left in a textbook evasion. But Bong had never intended to alter his flight path to chase a fleeing target. Bong had already constructed a complex three-dimensional model in his head. He didn't need to turn, because the P-38's guns fired straight without a convergence point. He merely needed to predict the Zero's flight path. Plummeting at 450 miles per hour, in the microseconds before their paths crossed, Bong made an almost imperceptible rudder adjustment, aiming the nose slightly ahead of the Zero's projected trajectory into empty space. Then, he squeezed the trigger. It wasn't a standard burst of gunfire. It sounded like tons of metal being violently ripped apart. The 20mm cannon for heavy machine guns roared as one, vomiting a blinding stream of armor-piercing, incendiary, and high-explosive rounds. This high-density river of kinetic energy and fire sliced perfectly into the Japanese fighter's turn. The Inarmator Zero was as fragile as a paper toy against this apocalyptic firepower. High-explosive rounds instantly shredded the paper-thin engine cowling, brutally snapped the main wing spar, and ignited the unprotected aviation fuel. In less than a second, the graceful Japanese fighter, which had just attempted a masterful counter, attack-naded into a blinding, rapidly expanding fireball of bright orange. Raining down toward the green jungle below was nothing but burning aluminum, shattered instruments, and ash. One shot, one kill, no wasted movement. But this was merely the opening act of a breathtaking massacre. Bong didn't pause for a single second to admire the deadly fireworks. In a flash, he gripped the impossibly heavy yoke with both hands and pulled back with every ounce of strength in his body. Massive G-forces instantly slammed into his chest like an invisible, ancient leviathan, pinning him deep into his hard, aluminum seat. The centrifugal force ripped the blood from his brain, sending it pooling into his legs. The edges of his vision rapidly blackened and collapsed into a narrow, dark tunnel. The terrifying precursor to GLOC, gravity-induced loss of consciousness, but relying on a rugged physique built through years of brutal farm labor. Bong violently clamped down his abdominal and leg muscles, physically forcing the blood back up to his brain. Fighting through the crushing weight, the immense kinetic energy accumulated during the thousands of feet of freefall was flawlessly converted by the aircraft's aerodynamic design into unparalleled climbing potential. Roaring with deafening power, the 8-ton P-38 pointed its nose skyward in an impossibly steep, near-vertical climb, piercing the blue heavens like an arrow. Unleashed from the earth, this audacious move utterly enraged the surrounding adversary pilots. In their minds, a fighter aircraft, was supposed to level out after an attack and engage in a swirling melee at the same altitude. This American hit-and run tactic was a massive insult to their pride as elite aviators. Instantly, Three's Eros flipped over, pushed their throttles to the firewall, and tried to bite onto Bong's tail, following him straight up. The proud adversary pilots tried to use their incredibly light weight to outclimb the massive American plane, thoroughly convinced that the heavy P-38 would bleed off its energy first. Their understanding of physics was about to be proved unfatally wrong. In this vertical arena of death, massive weight was no longer a liability, it was the ultimate currency for maintaining momentum. The lightweight design of the pursuing adversary planes made them undisputed kings of horizontal circles, but against the unforgiving pull of gravity, their lightweight engines simply couldn't produce the raw thrust required to sustain a vertical climb. As he rocketed upward, Bong glanced back through the bulletproof glass behind his head, coldly observing the scene below. He didn't panic or radio his wingman for help. He didn't even ease off the throttle. He simply waited, letting the cold, immutable laws of physics do their work. He watched clearly as the first pursuing adversary fighter began to bleed speed violently under the drag of gravity. Its nose began to involuntarily pitch up, its propeller churning uselessly through the thinning air, no longer generating enough lift over its stubby wings to maintain flight. It had reached the absolute edge of a stall. A moment later, the aggressive adversary aircraft lost all momentum, hanging helplessly in the air like a wind-up toy that had run out of spring tension. The pilots stomped the rudder and thrashed the stick, but the machine was completely out of control, beginning to fall away like a dead leaf. At the exact moment, the adversary fighter exhausted its energy and hung suspended. Bong, sitting high above, still commanding massive kinetic energy, simply kicked his rudder, elegantly flipping the massive P-38 over on its back. From that second on, he became the god of that airspace. The 5 deadly barrels in his nose pointed directly at the stalled, helpless enemy aircraft below, which lacked the airflow to even attempt to dodge. The second dive attack began. This time, there was no need for complex deflection, shooting, or anticipating evasive maneuvers. This wasn't combat, it was a cold, calculated aerial execution. Another devastatingly short burst of fire erupted from the nose. The dense swarm of 20mm and 50 caliber rounds tore through the helpless Ero's cockpit, fuselage, and engine like a monsoon, lacking self-sealing tanks. The Zero once again became the sky's brightest torch. The second aircraft blew apart in mid-air, its metallic fragments catching the harsh tropical sunlight as they fell. This was no honorable duel between knights of the sky. It was a one-sided slaughter, dictated by absolute physical superiority. This maneuver would later be immortalized in air combat manuals as the high yo-yo, or vertical energy fighting. But on this day, in a span of 12 minutes, a 22-year-old farm boy elevated the tactic to a terrifying, flawless art form. Bong never stopped. He pulled the nose up again and again, perfectly trading his massive diving kinetic energy for the altitude advantage, ruthlessly dragging enemy who tried to follow him into the fatal trap of a stall. The moment the enemy lost speed and became a static target, he would flip his nose over and dive, like a falcon locking on to its prey. His attack rhythm was like a programmed machine, precise, hyper-efficient, devoid of emotion. He refused to tangle with the enemy for even a second. He never fell into the horizontal turning traps they desperately wanted him in. He used absolute speed, absolute altitude, and absolute concentrated firepower to harvest the lives of invincible Japanese aces. A third enemy aircraft tried to dodge in a dive, but the terrifying closure rate of the P-38 left it nowhere to hide. The plane was literally sawed in half by the wall of lead. A fourth enemy tried to use the clouds for cover, but Bong, operating on pure predatory instinct, caught a momentary exposure at the cloud break and shattered its canopy with a pinpoint burst. in less than 12 minutes. Over the sweltering Markham Valley, an area that was supposed to be an enemy hunting ground, Richard Bong dragged a heavy, unconventional fighter that purists despised through the violently outnumbering enemy formation, tearing them apart. For adversary aces, men who had terrified Allied pilots since the beginning of the war were reduced to 4 pillars of black smoke rising from the dense New Guinea jungle. The once fierce adversary squadron was mentally broken by this illogical, terrifying new form of warfare. The surviving fighters scattered and fled when Bong finally ran out of 20mm shells and depleted nearly all his machine gun ammo, and with his fuel gauges redlining from the sustained high G, full throttle abuse, he leveled out. The 2 overheated Allison engines let out a deep, powerful roar, carrying him away at over 400 miles per hour like a literal bolt of lightning. He left behind a bewildered, traumatized remnant of adversary pilots wandering through the smoke, completely oblivious as to how to counter what they had just witnessed. When the oil-streaked P-38 Lightning, its aluminum skin scorched black around the exhaust stacks from extreme heat, touched down on the rutted, dusty dirt strip at the New Guinea frontline base, the ground crew swarmed it. To their absolute shock, they could not find a single bullet hole on the massive aircraft that had just spent 12 minutes brawling inside a swarm of enemy fighters. Bong climbed out of the cramped, sweltering cockpit. His khaki flight suit was so drenched in sweat it had turned dark brown, he could literally pour water out of his boots. Yet, his young, almost boyish face retained that same calm, slightly shy expression. It looked as though he hadn't just survived a terrifying dance with death, but had simply finished plowing a deeply familiar field back in Wisconsin. That 12-minute, earth-shattering rampage didn't just earn Richard Bong ultimate glory, the Distinguished Service Cross. Far more importantly, it fundamentally changed the tactical doctrine of the entire Allied air war in the Pacific through a brutally violent visual masterclass. In combat, he proved a bloody truth to every Allied pilot still terrified of dogfighting Zeros when facing a lethal war machine. Never play to the enemy's strengths. Abandon the fantasy of graceful, turning duels. Use your engine power, use your heavy armor, use your absolute speed, and use your vertical energy to crush them without mercy. From that day forward, the boom and zoom energy fighting tactic became the absolute law for American fighters engaging high-mobility adversary aircraft. Throughout the rest of the war, Richard Bong pushed this art of physics and energy manipulation to its absolute zenith. He ultimately destroyed an astonishing 40 enemy aircraft, becoming the highest-scoring and undisputed ace of aces in American history, earning the military's highest award for valor, the Medal of Honor. Tragically, the universe played a cruel and deeply ironic joke on the mechanical genius who had walked away from the deadliest meat grinders of the air war. On August 6, 1945, the very same day the atomic bomb named Little Boy detonated over Hiroshima, signaling the imminent end of the war. Bong, having returned stateside as a national hero, was killed while testing the P-80 Shooting Star, the bleeding edge of jet-age aviation technology. The primary fuel pump suffered a catastrophic failure, causing him to crash in California. He was only 24 years old. The history of the Second World War is written through a blend of sterile combat reports and the blood of young men who never came home. When we brush away the dust of history today and review these fading archives, we shouldn't just see the mythologized halos of heroes and cold kill counts. We must recognize how, at the bleeding edge where technology, steel, and violence violently collide, ordinary young men like Richard Bong stood on the precipice of terror and death, using absolute, icy logic and unbreakable will and a masterful command of machinery and physics. They carved the most awe-inspiring chapters of human courage. and intellect into the three-dimensional void of the sky. Those brief 12 minutes over the Markham Valley on July 26, 1943, were not merely a brilliant tactical victory, they were the purest, most ultimate expression of the aesthetics of violence within the roar of machinery. It is a moment forever etched into the heavens of military history, silently reminding us all that, on the razor-thin boundary between life and death, sometimes the only rule of survival is a plunge into the abyss that borders on absolute madness. If you want more hardcore breakdowns, smash that like button.